My daughter, Susan, forgot to end the call. In the sudden, crackling silence that followed her cheerful goodbye, I heard the two sentences that would shatter my world. It's time for him to go to a nursing home. He's a burden. Just moments before, the scent of pine and cedar had filled my small workshop, a fragrance that had been my life's perfume for over 50 years. My hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, moved with familiar grace over a block of cherry wood I was shaping into a small jewelry box for my granddaughter's upcoming birthday. The late afternoon sun of Phoenix cast long, golden shadows across the floor, illuminating motes of sawdust dancing in the air like tiny fireflies. It was peaceful. It was the life I had built, a quiet rhythm of purpose even after my beloved Eleanor had passed. The phone buzzed against the workbench, and I smiled when Susan's name lit up the screen. I wiped my hands on my canvas apron before answering, the familiar warmth spreading through my chest. "Hey, sweetheart, how's the business trip?" Her voice was bright, full of the energy I had always admired. "It's going well, Dad. Just wanted to check in on you. Are you eating properly?" "Of course," I chuckled, leaning against the sturdy oak bench I'd built with my own 2 hands 3 decades ago. "An old carpenter knows how to take care of himself. Don't you worry about me." We talked for another 10 minutes about things that seemed important at the time: the weather, her potential clients, the antics of her cat. She ended the call the way she always did. "Okay, Dad, I've got to run to a dinner meeting. I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," I said, my heart full. I heard the click, but it was followed by a faint rustling, the sound of a phone being dropped into a purse but not disconnected. I was about to hang up my end when I heard her voice again, no longer warm and loving, but sharp and clinical. It was followed by the deeper tone of my son-in-law, Richard. "Did you tell him about our plan?" Richard asked. "No, not yet," Susan sighed. "He sounded so happy just to hear from me. But Richard, we have to do this. He almost left the stove on again last week." My hand froze, hovering over the end call button. My workshop, my sanctuary, suddenly felt cold. "I know, honey." Richard's voice was smooth, logical. "It's time for him to go to a nursing home. He's a burden, and you know it. We can sell the house, get that place in Scottsdale we've been dreaming of. That property is worth a fortune now." A burden. The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor. The sound echoed in the sudden, deafening silence. I stared at the half-finished jewelry box on my bench, its delicate carving seeming to mock me. For 50 years these hands had built, provided, and protected. And in a single, careless moment, I learned it was all for nothing. I was no longer a father. I was just a problem to be managed. A burden. The small, plastic rectangle lay on the dusty concrete, an insignificant object that had just detonated my life. For how long I stared at it, I couldn't say. Time seemed to have frozen, trapping me in that single, horrific moment. A burden. The word echoed in the silence, stripping away 50 years of love and sacrifice, leaving me bare and exposed. With a hand that felt disconnected from my body, I bent down and picked up the phone. The line was dead. I pressed the red button to make sure. A final, futile gesture. My gaze drifted around my workshop. It had always been my sanctuary, a place of creation and peace. Now, it felt like a museum of my own foolishness. The tools hanging neatly on the wall, the stacks of lumber waiting to be given life, the faint smell of sawdust, it all spoke of a man who believed his work meant something, that the love he poured into every joint and every polished surface would be his legacy. What a fool I'd been. My legacy wasn't this workshop, or the house I built with these same hands. My legacy was a daughter who saw me as an obstacle and an inheritance to be cashed in. I walked to the large window that overlooked the backyard, my backyard. I had laid every single brick of that patio. I had built the pergola where Eleanor and I used to sit on summer evenings, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in hues of orange and purple. We had planted that mesquite tree together, a tiny sapling the day we moved in, now a great sprawling giant that shaded the entire yard. Susan had learned to ride her bike on that patio. We'd hosted her 16th birthday party under that tree. Every memory, once a source of warmth, now felt like a shard of glass in my heart. The pain was immense, a physical ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. It would have been easy to crumble, to let the grief and despair consume me. And for a moment I almost did. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window, my shoulders slumping with the weight of it all. But then, something else began to stir beneath the pain. A slow, burning ember of anger. They thought I was old. They thought I was confused, forgetful, weak. A piece of furniture to be moved and discarded when it became inconvenient. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my quiet grief for Eleanor as senility, my generosity as a weakness to be exploited. The ember glowed hotter, burning away the sorrow, forging it into something hard and sharp. Resolve. I pushed myself away from the window, my back straightening. The stoop in my shoulders was gone. I looked at my hands, not as the hands of a feeble old man, but as the hands of a master carpenter who knew how to measure, cut, and build with precision. I had built a life from nothing once. I could certainly dismantle it with the same care. I would not be managed, I would not be a burden, and I would not be erased. I turned off the lights in the workshop, plunging the room into darkness, and walked toward the door to the house. My house. For now. My footsteps were no longer the shuffle of a lonely widower. They were the steady, deliberate steps of a man with a plan. Sleep had been a stranger to me that night. I had sat in Eleanor's armchair, the grandfather clock in the hall marking each passing hour of my new, cold reality. When the first light of dawn broke over the Phoenix horizon, I didn't feel tired. I felt a clarity I hadn't known in years. I knew I couldn't do this alone. There was only one person I trusted enough, one person who had seen me through the darkest days after Eleanor's passing, Charlie. I found him at our usual spot, a small, sun-drenched cafe called the Silver Cactus, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. He was already at our table by the window, a half-finished crossword puzzle and 2 cups of black coffee waiting. He looked up and smiled, his weathered face crinkling at the corners of his eyes. "Morning, Art. You look like you wrestled a bear and lost." I tried to return the smile, but it felt like a foreign expression on my face. "Something like that, Charlie." I sat down, the familiar comfort of our routine feeling hollow. We made small talk for a few minutes. Charlie complained about his new sprinkler system, and I pretended to listen, nodding and sipping my coffee. But he knew me too well. He put down his pen, his gaze turning serious. "All right, Arthur, out with it. What's really going on? I haven't seen that look in your eyes since the funeral." The simple, direct kindness in his voice broke through the dam I had built around my emotions. I took a deep breath, the smell of roasting coffee beans suddenly sharp and overwhelming, and I told him everything. I recounted the cheerful phone call, the accidental eavesdropping, the cold, calculating words that had become seared into my memory. "A burden," I finished, my own voice sounding distant and strained. "He called me a burden, Charlie." Charlie didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't say, "They probably didn't mean it." He just listened, his jaw tightening as I spoke. When I was done, he was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the people walking by, living their normal, untroubled lives. Finally, he turned back to me, his eyes dark with a gravity that startled me. "Art, I'm going to tell you a story," he said quietly. "My cousin Frank, over in Tucson, a widower just like you, doted on his kids, gave them everything. They convinced him he was getting too old to manage his finances, got him to sign power of attorney. Within 6 months, they had sold his house from under him and put him in the cheapest facility they could find. He died a year later, heartbroken and broke." The story landed like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a clear and present danger. "I am not going to let that happen to you," Charlie said, his voice firm as steel. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "But to stop it, you need to stop thinking like a father right now. The man who raised that girl is not the man who can win this fight. You need to start thinking like a businessman protecting his assets. This is no longer a family matter. This is war." Charlie's words hung in the air between us, more potent than the strong aroma of the coffee. War. He was right. My gentle, fatherly approach was a language my daughter and her husband no longer understood. They spoke the language of assets, of burdens, of monetary value. It was a language I would have to learn, and fast. I nodded slowly, the fog of my grief finally clearing to reveal a path forward, a path paved not with sorrow, but with cold, hard strategy. "You're right," I said, my voice low but steady. "You're absolutely right, Charlie." A look of relief washed over his face. He reached for his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind that held a lifetime of receipts and memories. He flipped it open and carefully extracted a crisp, cream-colored business card from one of the slots. He slid it across the table to me. "This is your first move," he said. I picked it up. The card felt substantial in my hand, the letters embossed with a professional flair. Todd Fisher, Esquire Real Estate and Asset Protection. "Fisher is a shark," Charlie explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "But he's an honest shark, and he's our shark. He specializes in protecting people like us from situations exactly like this. He helped Eleanor's sister when her son tried to pull a fast one. He's sharp, he's discreet, and he doesn't mess around. Call him today, Art, not tomorrow, today." I stared at the name on the card. Todd Fisher. It wasn't just a name, it was a weapon, a tool. It was the first piece of lumber for the new life I was about to build, a life where I was the sole architect. The helplessness that had clung to me like a shroud since last night began to evaporate under the harsh, bright light of purpose. I wasn't just a sad old man in a coffee shop anymore. I was a client, a man with assets, a man with a plan. I looked up from the card and met my friend's gaze. "Thank you, Charlie," I said, and the words were inadequate for the lifetime of friendship and the lifeline he had just thrown me. "I don't know what I would have done." "You would have figured it out," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "You're a builder, Arthur. You just needed the right set of blueprints. Now go home and make the call." I carefully placed the business card in my shirt pocket, right over my heart. I paid for the coffee, a small, ordinary act that felt monumental. As I walked out of the silver cactus and into the bright Arizona sun, I didn't feel the heat. I felt a fire inside me. My hand rested on my pocket, the sharp edge of the card a constant reminder of my new purpose. The war had begun, and I had just been given my first orders. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove to a small park overlooking the city, the business card a solid weight in my pocket. I sat on a bench and watched the cars move below, a river of anonymous lives. For the first time, I felt like I was in control of my own current. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the card before doubt could creep in. A calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Law offices of Todd Fisher." "My name is Arthur Hayes," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I was referred by Charles Miller. I need to schedule a consultation as soon as possible." The receptionist was efficient. There had been a cancellation. Mr. Fisher could see me at 3 o'clock that afternoon. It felt like a sign. The law office was located in a modest but respectable building downtown. The interior was all dark wood, leather armchairs, and shelves lined with imposing law books. It was a world away from my workshop, a world of contracts and consequences. It was exactly where I needed to be. Todd Fisher was just as Charlie had described him, a man in his 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, but a calm demeanor that put me at ease. He listened without interruption as I laid out the entire story, from the phone call to the conversation with Charlie. I kept my tone even, presenting the facts as if I were describing a construction project, not the wreckage of my family. When I finished, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered something better. Clarity. "Mr. Hayes, let me ask you a few direct questions. First, is the title of your house solely in your name?" "Yes," I said. "It was in my and my wife's name. When she passed, it transferred entirely to me." "And you have no outstanding mortgages or liens against the property?" "None. I paid it off 17 years ago." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Then, legally speaking, the situation is incredibly simple. It is your house. Period. Your daughter and son-in-law have absolutely zero legal claim to it. They cannot force you to sell it, and they cannot force you into any kind of care facility without your consent, which would require proving you are mentally incompetent, a claim that, based on our conversation, is absurd." Every word he spoke lifted a weight from my shoulders. It wasn't just Charlie's opinion anymore. It was the law. So, what are my options? I asked. You have many, Fisher said. You could change the locks and formally evict them. You could change your will, or given what you've told me about their intentions. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. You could sell the house. The Phoenix market is white hot. A well-maintained property like yours would be gone in days, likely for a cash offer. The idea, once a nascent seed of revenge, now bloomed into a viable, powerful strategy. How fast is days? With the right buyer, we could potentially close in as little as 10 business days. 10 days. Susan and Richard would still be on their business trip. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. This was it. This was the path. I had the power, the right, and now the legal backing. Mr. Fisher, I said, leaning forward, I need the name of the most aggressive, fastest, working real estate agent you know. For the first time, a hint of a smile touched Todd Fisher's lips. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out another business card. I didn't even wait to get back to my truck. Standing on the pavement outside the law office, with the hum of downtown Phoenix around me, I dialed the number for Brian Connor. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and full of energy. I explained that I was referred by Todd Fisher and wanted to sell my house quickly. How quickly are we talking? He asked, his tone all business. Yesterday would be nice, I replied. He laughed, a short, appreciative bark. I like your style, Mr. Hayes. I have a gap in my schedule this afternoon. Can you do 4 o'clock? At precisely 4, a sleek, modern sedan pulled into my driveway. Brian Connor emerged, looking exactly like the kind of man who could sell a house in a day. He was younger than me, maybe in his early 40s, with a confident handshake and eyes that took in everything. As he stepped into my entryway, his professional demeanor faltered for just a moment. He stopped and looked up. Wow, he said, his gaze fixed on the crown molding I had spent a month perfecting. He ran a hand along the solid oak banister of the staircase. This is quality. You don't see work like this anymore. He thought I had hired a master craftsman. I did it myself, I said, a flicker of old pride stirring in my chest. I was a carpenter for 50 years. That changed everything. As we walked through the house, it was no longer just a tour. It was an inspection between two professionals. He didn't just see a living room. He saw the seamless way I had joined the hardwood floors. He didn't just see a kitchen. He saw the custom-built cherrywood cabinets and the perfect fit of the granite countertops. He noted the natural light pouring in from the bay window I'd built for Eleanor, a feature he called a premium selling point. Oh, for the first time in a long time, someone saw the value in my work. Not the sentimental value, but the real, tangible, skillful value. It was a balm to the wound my daughter had carved into my soul. This house wasn't just an asset to be liquidated. It was a testament to my life. And this stranger, this businessman, he saw it clearly. After the tour, we sat at the kitchen table where I had once paid bills for my daughter's college tuition. Brian tapped calculations into his tablet, pulling up comparable sales in the area. Okay, Arthur, he said, looking up, his expression serious. Given the market, and more importantly, the immaculate condition and custom craftsmanship of this home, I'd list it at $890,000. The number hung in the air, so large it felt unreal. It was more than Susan and Richard had even dared to imagine. That much? I managed to say. Easily, Brian said with confidence. But we can do better than just listing it. I have an investment group I work with. They buy properties like this for their high-end rental portfolio. They pay cash. No financing, no appraisals, no haggling over repairs. They look for quality, and this, he gestured around the room, is exactly what they want. My heart began to beat faster. This was the opening I needed. What's the timeline on a deal like that? Brian smiled, knowing he was about to close. They can make an offer within 24 hours. And from there, we can close in 10 business days. 10 business days. The words echoed in the quiet kitchen, a countdown clock to my own liberation. It was a perfect, elegant solution, faster and cleaner than I could have ever hoped for. There was no hesitation. I looked Brian Connor straight in the eye, the reflection of a determined old man staring back at me from his pupils. Let's do it, I said. Brian's professional smile broadened into one of genuine admiration. Excellent choice, Arthur. I'll have my team draw up the initial offer tonight. We can sign tomorrow morning if you're available. 9 o'clock? 9 o'clock is perfect, I replied, shaking his hand. The deal was done. The next morning, Brian arrived with a leather portfolio and an air of quiet efficiency. He spread the documents across my kitchen table. Sale price, $890,000. Cash purchase. Closing date, 10 business days from signing. Minimal contingencies. It was all there, in black and white. My escape plan, codified in legal jargon. Brian handed me a pen, its weight feeling heavy and final in my hand. Just sign here, and here, Arthur, he said gently. I uncapped the pen. The tip hovered over the signature line, the point of no return. And then, my phone, sitting on the counter, began to ring. The screen lit up with Susan's face. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a test. The universe was testing my resolve. I held up a hand to Brian, a silent request for a moment. He nodded with understanding. I took a breath and answered, forcing a warmth I did not feel into my voice. Hi, sweetheart. Everything all right? Everything's great, Dad, she chirped, oblivious. Just wanted to tell you we booked our flights home. We'll be back next Friday. We were thinking maybe we could take you out for a nice dinner that weekend? To talk about some things. To talk about my future, I thought. A future they had planned in a nursing home. To talk about this house, which would no longer be mine. The irony was a bitter pill. That sounds lovely, Susan, I said, my eyes fixed on the contract. Great. So, how are things with you? Keeping busy in the workshop? Always, I said, the lie tasting like ash. Just finishing up a little project. The project of reclaiming my life. That's wonderful, Dad. You take care of yourself, okay? We'll see you soon. You too, Susan. Goodbye. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the counter. The forced conversation, the casual deceit in her voice, had extinguished any lingering flicker of doubt. My hand was rock steady as I picked up the pen again. I was no longer just protecting myself. I was serving a necessary, painful justice. I signed my name Arthur Hayes on the line. The ink was dark and decisive against the page. It was done. The house was no longer mine. The future was. With the contract signed, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The decision was made. The outcome was set in motion. Now came the logistical phase, and as a man who had spent his life with blueprints and building plans, this was a language I understood perfectly. I had 9 days until the closing. 9 days to build the scaffolding for my new life. I spent the first 2 days in front of my computer, a tool I had used sparingly but now attacked with methodical precision. My search term was simple: Senior Independent Living Apartments, Phoenix. The results were overwhelming, a sea of glossy photos and cheerful marketing slogans. I sifted through them with a carpenter's eye for detail, discarding the ones that felt too much like hospitals and focusing on those that promised community and autonomy. I created a short list of 3 promising locations, all in neighborhoods Susan and Richard had never bothered to visit. I called each one, using the clear, confident voice of a man simply planning his retirement, not a man fleeing his own family. The first place was clean but sterile, with long, quiet hallways that smelled faintly of disinfectant. The residents I saw in the common area looked tired and resigned. It felt too much like the future Susan had planned for me. I thanked the manager and left without a backward glance. The second was too fancy, with a grand lobby and a list of social activities that seemed exhausting. It was a place for wealthy couples to spend their golden years together, a painful reminder of everything I had lost with Eleanor. The third place was called Sunset Manor. It was modest, a collection of low-rise buildings surrounded by well-tended desert gardens. The manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, showed me a 1-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor, with a small balcony overlooking a courtyard with a bubbling fountain. It was simple, it was clean. It wasn't my home, but it could be a home. It was small enough for one person to manage, but large enough to hold the few precious memories I planned to keep. We have an active woodworking club, you know, Mrs. Chen mentioned as we stood on the balcony. They're always looking for new members with real skill. That sealed it. This wasn't an ending. It was a continuation. I'll take it, I said, surprising her with my quick decision. The application process usually takes a few, she started. I can pay the deposit and the first 3 months' rent right now. In cash, I said, cutting her off gently. I had withdrawn a large sum from my bank account that morning, knowing cash left fewer trails. Her eyebrows rose slightly, but in the world of property management, money spoke a universal language. An hour later, I walked out of Sunset Manor with a signed lease and a set of keys that felt entirely different from the ones in my pocket. The old keys represented a life that was ending, a past built for others. These new keys, they represented a future that belonged only to me. The morning of the 10th day arrived, bright and clear. I chose my outfit carefully, not my best suit, but a simple pressed collared shirt and clean slacks. I wanted to look like a man in control, not a man in mourning or celebration. Today was about business. My business. The title company office was a quiet, neutral space, designed to facilitate life-changing transactions with as little drama as possible. Brian was already there, along with a sharp-looking woman who represented the investment group. We exchanged polite, professional nods. There was no small talk. The documents were laid out on the large mahogany table. I read each one, my mind clear and focused. The deed transfer, the settlement statement, the final acknowledgments. My signature was required on a dozen different lines. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a chain breaking. I wasn't just signing away a house. I was signing away a lifetime of misplaced obligations. I was severing the final tie to the girl who had forgotten what it meant to be a daughter. The final document was slid in front of me. "This is your wire transfer confirmation, Arthur," the title agent said softly. "The funds, less closing costs and fees, have been deposited into your account." I looked at the numbers on the page. $890,000. It wasn't just money. It was security. It was freedom. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on the past. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in my inside pocket. We shook hands all around. The buyer's representative smiled. "Congratulations on the sale, Mr. Hayes. They're very pleased with the property." "I'm sure they will be," I said. It was built to last. I thanked Brian in the lobby, who promised to stay in touch. But I knew I wouldn't need his services again. I had one last destination. I didn't drive back towards my old neighborhood, nor towards Sunset Manor. I drove to a different part of the city, to a small local institution called the Arizona Community Bank. I had made an appointment here last week under the pretense of planning my estate. The bank manager, David Morrison, was expecting me. I explained that my plans had changed, that I had just sold my primary asset and wished to move all my funds to an institution that valued discretion. He understood completely. We spent the next hour opening a new series of accounts, including a high-yield savings account and a simple checking account. Then, we initiated the wire transfer from my old bank. "The funds should clear by tomorrow morning, Mr. Hayes," David said, shaking my hand. "Welcome to Arizona Community Bank." Walking out of that bank, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in 2 years, not since Eleanor's diagnosis. The money was safe. My future was secure. The financial part of my plan was complete. Now, only the final, personal act remained. With my future secured, it was time to dismantle the past. I called a 24-hour locksmith and arranged to meet him at the Maple Street house that evening. I parked in the garage, using the remote for the last time before deactivating it, wanting to avoid any curious glances from the neighbors. The locksmith, a quiet man named Eddie, worked with an efficient, impersonal air. I watched him drill out the old lock set on the front door, the very same brass hardware Eleanor had picked out 25 years ago because it matched the door knocker. The sound of the drill was a screeching, metallic finality. He handed me a small ring of silver keys that felt cold and foreign in my palm. They were keys to a fortress, not a home. After he left, I stood alone in the entryway of the house that was no longer mine. It was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a familiar space. It was the empty, expectant silence of a stage waiting for the final act. I walked from room to room, a ghost in my own life. I had one suitcase to fill, one suitcase to contain the essence of a 50-year marriage and a lifetime of fatherhood. How do you choose? In our bedroom, I opened Eleanor's jewelry box. I took her wedding ring and the small locket I had given her on our 10th anniversary. I left the rest. I took the framed photo of her from our nightstand, her smile a beacon from a kinder world. From my own dresser, I took nothing but my father's old pocket watch. In my workshop, I packed a single, hand-carved mallet, the first tool I had ever made for myself. It felt right to have it with me. Then my eyes landed on a small, intricately carved wooden box on a high shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust. I took it down, my fingers tracing the initials carved into the lid. S.H. Susan Hayes. I had made it for her 5th birthday to hold her treasures. With a heavy heart, I placed the box in my suitcase. It would be my last gift to her, a reminder of a time when her heart was filled with wonder, not greed. Everything else would stay. The furniture I had built, the photo albums chronicling Susan's happy childhood, the books Eleanor had loved. They were part of the house now. Let the new owners decide their fate. I closed the suitcase. It felt impossibly light, yet it carried the entire weight of my world. Standing in the living room, I took one last look around. I wasn't leaving a home anymore. I was abandoning a crime scene, a place where a family had been murdered by avarice. My sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard sense of purpose. The stage was set. My suitcase stood by the door, a silent testament to a life condensed. But my work here wasn't finished. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming box. Inside, nestled in foam, was the final component of my plan, a piece of modern trickery that felt both alien and essential. It looked like a simple USB phone charger, the kind you'd see in any home. But inside its plastic shell was a high-definition camera lens, a microphone, and a Wi-Fi transmitter. It was my eye, my ear, the silent witness to the justice that was coming. I had spent the previous evening at Sunset Manor studying the device, my old carpenter's mind appreciating the cleverness of its construction. The instructions were simple, and I followed them with the same precision I used when measuring a piece of rare hardwood. I synced it with an app on my smartphone, watching in amazement as my own face stared back at me from the screen, captured by the tiny lens. Now, in the empty house, I found the perfect location. There was a low electrical outlet on the wall of the entryway, partially hidden by a small console table where Eleanor used to keep her keys. It was a spot you would never look at twice. I plugged the charger in. A tiny pinprick of blue light blinked once, then vanished. It was active. I retreated to the living room, pulling out my phone. The app connected instantly. On my screen, I saw a perfect, wide-angle view of the front door and the entire entryway. The quality was remarkably clear. I could see the grain of the wood on the door I had installed myself, the subtle scuff marks on the floor where years of life had happened. I walked back into the frame, testing the motion detection. A silent notification popped up on my phone. It worked perfectly. It would begin recording the moment anyone stepped through that door. They would be the actors, and I would be the audience. The thought sent a cold, thrilling shiver down my spine. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about truth. I wanted to see their faces when they realized their betrayal had not gone unnoticed. I wanted to hear their voices when the carefully constructed masks of concern and love finally shattered, revealing the raw greed beneath. I stood there for a long time, watching the empty doorway on my phone. A quiet, waiting stage. All the pieces were now in place. The money was secure. The new life was waiting. And the unblinking eye of the camera was ready to bear witness. I was no longer a victim waiting for the end. I was the director of this final, painful play, and the curtain was about to rise. With the camera in place, there was only one thing left to do. I walked to the kitchen counter and pulled out a single sheet of the thick, cream-colored stationery Eleanor had loved, along with my old fountain pen. I sat at the table where we had shared thousands of meals, the same table where my daughter had once done her homework under my watchful eye. The pen felt perfectly balanced in my hand. My handwriting was steady, the letters flowing across the page with an engineer's precision. It was not a letter of anger or of heartbreak. Those emotions had already burned away, leaving only the cold, hard truth. Dear Susan and Richard, if you are reading this, it means your keys no longer work. That is by design. I imagine you are surprised. I was also surprised a few weeks ago when I overheard your phone conversation about my future. I heard your plans to put me in a nursing home, and I heard you refer to me as a burden. I have decided to relieve you of that burden. The house has been sold. The final sale price was $890,000, cash. The money is now in a new bank account at an institution you are not aware of, and it is secure. It will be used to fund my own future, one of my own choosing. I have moved to a place where I am a neighbor and a friend, not an inconvenience. Do not try to find me. Your belongings from the guest room have been packed and are waiting for you at a storage facility. You have 30 days to claim them. For 42 years, I gave you everything a father could give. You repaid that love with a plan to discard me so you could steal the fruits of my life's work. I hope the lesson you learn from this is worth the price. Dad, I didn't sign it with love. The word felt like a lie. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote their names on the front. I walked to the front door, and using a piece of strong tape from my workshop, affixed it at eye level. It was perfectly centered, directly in the camera's unwavering gaze. With that, my work was done. I picked up my single suitcase. I took one last sweeping glance around the living room. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel regret. I felt closure. I had built this house with love, and I would leave it with dignity. I stepped outside into the warm Arizona evening, closed the door behind me, and turned the new lock. The click was sharp, clean, and final. I did not look back. Friday afternoon, I sat in a comfortable armchair in my new apartment at Sunset Manor, a cup of coffee steaming on the small table beside me. Outside my window, the life of the community went on, neighbors chatting, someone tending to their potted plants. It was a world of peaceful, ordinary moments. But my attention was fixed on the small, dark screen of my smartphone resting on my lap. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't excited. I was simply waiting. A carpenter waiting for the varnish to dry. At 5:15 p.m., it happened. The phone buzzed, a crisp electronic vibration that cut through the quiet. The screen lit up with a notification. Motion detected at front door. I took a slow sip of coffee before tapping the notification. The app opened, and the live feed filled my screen. A black SUV, Richard's car, was pulling into the driveway of my former house. My house. My breath hitched just for a second. They were here. Susan stepped out first, stretching her arms over her head, after the long drive from the airport. Richard emerged from the driver's side, pulling their expensive suitcases from the back. They moved with an air of casual ownership, the weary but triumphant conquerors returning to their castle. They had no idea the locks to the kingdom had been changed. I watched as Susan, fishing a key from her purse, walked confidently to the front door. Richard followed, setting the luggage down with a thud. She inserted the key into the lock. She tried to turn it. Nothing. She frowned, a little crease appearing between her eyebrows. She jiggled it, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "That's weird." Her voice came through the phone's speaker, tinny and distant. "My key's not working." Richard stepped forward, his own expression shifting from tired to irritated. "Here, let me." He took his own key and tried. The result was the same. The lock held firm. The new silver deadbolt I had watched Eddie install was doing its job perfectly. "What the hell?" Richard muttered, examining the lock more closely. "This looks different." Panic began to creep into Susan's voice. "What do you mean different? Dad wouldn't change the locks." I'll try the back door," Richard said, his voice tight with a growing sense of alarm. He disappeared around the side of the house. Susan remained at the front door, trying her key again and again, as if repetition could somehow change reality. A few minutes later, Richard reappeared, his face pale. "They're all changed," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The back door, the garage side entrance, they're all new locks. Someone changed the locks, Susan." "That's impossible," she cried, her voice rising in panic. She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling him." I watched her dial, watched her face fall as the call went unanswered. The confusion on their faces was slowly curdling into real fear. It was Richard who started examining the windows, his mind clearly racing. "There," he pointed. "The kitchen window. The latch looks loose. I can boost you up." I watched on my phone screen, my knuckles white as I gripped the device. Susan scrambled awkwardly through the kitchen window, her expensive business suit snagging on the latch. She landed with a graceless thud on the floor, a stark contrast to the confident woman who had stepped out of the SUV just minutes before. She hurried to the front door, her hands fumbling with the new deadbolt from the inside. The door swung open, revealing Richard, his face a mask of anxiety. "What is going on?" he hissed as he stepped inside, dragging their luggage with him. "Did he fall? Should we call someone?" "I don't know, Richard. Susan's voice trailed off. Her eyes had locked onto it. The cream-colored envelope, taped squarely in the middle of the door, their names written in my unmistakable, neat script. It was impossible to miss. They both froze, staring at the letter as if it were a venomous snake. The air in my new apartment felt thick, and I realized I was holding my breath. I watched as Susan, with a visibly trembling hand, reached out and peeled the envelope from the door. Richard moved closer, crowding her, his eyes wide as he prepared to read over her shoulder. She tore it open. The camera's microphone was surprisingly sensitive. I could hear the rasp of the paper. Her eyes scanned the first lines. I saw the confusion on her face deepen. Then, as she continued to read, it began to shift. The confusion gave way to a dawning, sickening understanding. Her mouth fell slightly open. Her face, which had been flushed with panic, began to drain of all color. "No," she whispered, a sound so faint I could barely hear it. "No, no, no." Richard snatched the letter from her limp fingers, his own eyes flying across the page. His reaction was faster, angrier. His jaw clenched. I saw the muscles in his neck tighten. He read the words, "Sold, $890,000, and new bank account." I watched the precise moment their entire world, a world built on the foundation of my life's work, crumbled into dust. "He heard us," Richard breathed, the words laced with disbelief and fury. "That old bastard, he heard us on the phone." But Susan was stuck on one detail, the one that represented the future she had just lost. Her eyes were wide with a horror that was almost theatrical. She looked around the entryway, at the staircase, at the living room, as if seeing it all for the first time as something that was no longer hers. "He sold the house," she said, her voice quiet at first, then rising with each word, swelling with an incredible, piercing hysteria. "He sold our house? How could he do this to us?" The final question was a shriek, echoing through the silent, empty home, a sound of pure, unadulterated greed finally meeting its consequence. Susan's shriek died down into ragged, ugly sobs. She sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, her face buried in her hands. I expected Richard to go to her, to offer some form of comfort, however hollow. Instead, I watched as his face twisted into a snarl of pure contempt. "This is your fault," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Your father. You were supposed to have him wrapped around your little finger. You got soft." Susan's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with a fury that momentarily eclipsed her despair. "My fault?" she cried, her voice cracking. "You were the one who called him a burden. You were the one who couldn't wait to get your hands on this house. The nursing home was your idea, Richard." "Because he needed to be managed," Richard shot back, pacing the entryway like a caged animal. "And you were supposed to be the one to do it, but you were too busy playing the dutiful daughter to actually close the deal." The argument escalated, spiraling into a vortex of accusations and long-held resentments. The thin veneer of their happy marriage dissolved before my eyes, revealing the rotten core beneath. "Maybe if you still had a job, we wouldn't be in this mess," Susan screamed. "Maybe if my burden of a father hadn't been paying for our dinners and bailing you out for the last year, we wouldn't have been so desperate." Don't you dare bring that up," Richard warned, pointing a trembling finger at her. "I took a risk for us, for our future, the future your senile old man just flushed down the toilet." They were ugly, vicious. Two parasites turning on each other now that their host was gone. They fought amidst the silent witnesses of my life's work, the sturdy staircase, the polished floors, the family photos on the wall that they had never truly seen. They had coveted the shell of my life, but had never understood the love that held it together. The fight seemed to drain the last of their energy. Richard slumped into the armchair Eleanor had loved, running his hands through his hair in desperation. Susan remained on the stairs, her sobs now quiet, hopeless whimpers. They were broken, defeated not by me, but by their own greed. From the quiet of my new apartment, I watched them. I felt no triumph, no surge of victorious pleasure. I simply felt done. The anger had subsided, leaving behind only a vast, quiet emptiness. I had needed to see this. I had needed to see their true character, stripped bare of all pretense. And now I had. They were not monsters. They were just small, hollow people, and they were no longer my problem. With a quiet finality, I reached out and tapped the screen of my phone. The image of their pathetic collapse vanished, replaced by my ordinary home screen. I had seen enough. I deleted the camera app from my phone. Its purpose was served. I walked to the small kitchen in my new apartment and retrieved the bottle of wine I had brought from the old house, a Bordeaux that Eleanor and I had been saving for a special occasion that never came. Perhaps this was it. I poured a glass, the deep red liquid catching the light. I walked to the nightstand where her photo sat, her smile as warm and loving as ever. "To us, Eleanor," I whispered, raising the glass. "Justice is served." The wine was rich and smooth, and it tasted like peace. The next morning, I woke before the Sunday. I made a cup of strong black coffee and sat on my small balcony. I watched the sky over the Arizona desert slowly shift from inky black to a soft, bruised purple, then finally ignite into brilliant shades of orange and gold. It was the first sunrise of the rest of my life. I picked up my phone and called Charlie. He answered immediately. "Art? Is it done?" "It's done, Charlie," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips. I didn't need to tell him the sordid details. He could hear the change in my voice. "Good," he said simply. "So, when are we going fishing?" "How about next weekend?" I suggested. "It's a date," he said. "Welcome back, my friend." We hung up, and I continued to watch the morning unfold. A few floors below, I could see other residents of Sunset Manor starting their day, walking their dogs, reading the paper. Soon, I would join them. I would find the woodworking club Mrs. Chen had mentioned. I would build things again, not for obligation or for legacy, but for the simple joy of creation. I might even teach a class, pass on the skills these hands had spent a lifetime acquiring. The future stretched before me, not as a frightening, lonely void, but as an open road. Susan and Richard had tried to write the final chapter of my life for me, a sad little epilogue in a place of quiet despair, but they had failed. I was still the author of my own story. I was no longer a burden. I was no longer an asset to be managed. I was Arthur Hayes, a carpenter, a friend, a man who had built his life with his own two hands and, when it was threatened, had known how to build a fortress to protect it. I was a free man, sitting in the warm Arizona sun, ready to see what the next chapter would bring.